next presenter is Carl Greenbaum. So Carl, you were our second place on the contest, and we'd love to hear what you have to say about your moon-based design.
I really love the name of that winning design. Anyway, my design is referred to as Hermes lunar base, kind of in keeping with the tradition of naming crewed missions after Greek and Roman gods and goddesses. And Hermes, of course, is the Greek god of commerce, wealth, and travel. Well, I can begin, they're just pictures, right? In addition to selecting the name of Hermes, it occurred to me that a lot of people think that the moon's going to be the next gold rush. And when I thought about all the gold rushes in the past, it wasn't really the miners who made most of the money, it was the outfitters. And in a similar fashion, even before that, beavers, the trappers getting beavers in North America, that was the gold. And the Hudsons Bay Company created this network of outposts across the continent, and they became the standard place to go for supplies and equipment and provisions. And so I envision this Hermes lunar base as the Hudsons Bay Company of the 21st century. So if you can I've just talked through the first couple of slides, so if you can advance. It was the outfitters who made the money. And go ahead, next slide. Hudsons Bay Company. So the notion is, next slide, that the Hermes base will in fact be the Hudsons Bay Company of the 21st century. And, we have a name, we have a theme, and we're well on our way. Next slide, please. Where do we go? Next slide. Most people, many people have decided that the South Pole is the place to go. The L-Cross mission found what appeared to be large amounts of water there. Water is important to drink and to provide breathing oxygen, but most importantly, perhaps, it is also a source of rocket propellant. Next slide, please. So if we're going to go to the South Polar region, I looked at a topo map, and here is this giant massif, Leibniz 2. Next slide. It is over 6,000 meters above lunar datum. I figured this has got to be one of those peaks of perpetual light, and this was going to be the place. Unfortunately, the important dimension on this chart isn't the vertical axis, it's the horizontal axis. Leibniz is over 100 kilometers from the South Pole, and even though the moon has a low inclination, Leibniz is in darkness much of the time. Next slide, please. So plan B was a little plateau, which you may recognize from previous presentations. Next slide. There's a mesa that's only about 11 kilometers from the rim of Shackleton crater, and the actual South Pole is on the northwest corner of the Shackleton crater. And that plateau is about 2.7 kilometers long and about 3/4 of a kilometer wide, just about the right size for our lunar base. Next slide. How do we get there? Many of these rockets, at least the ones that are still extant, could, under some circumstances, get you to the moon. But one of the main challenges is getting from there onto the lunar surface. Next slide. NASA's human landing system. Now, I picked SpaceX before NASA did, and I don't have congressmen whispering in my ear now. So the SpaceX Starship was my vehicle of choice for getting to and down on the surface of the moon. Next slide. And in case anybody else wants to do this, there is already a Starship User's Guide version 1 available. You can learn all about it. Next slide. So we get down to the lunar surface. We need to live someplace, and let's talk about that for a while. Next. The basic habitat configuration is 4 inflatable modules, one each for what I call the operations, that's crew and base ops. Then there's one for hydroponics, we call that the garden, one for the aquaculture, that call that the fish farm. And the fourth is very much like the first one, it's housing and workspace for visitors, visiting scientists, tourists, whatever. Decided I wanted all the modules to be the same size. The garden needs the most space at about 1,200 square meters. And so the common size for all of these modules is 30 by 40 meters. And they need to be covered by at least 1.5 meters of regolith for radiation and micrometeorite protection. Next slide, please. So covering an existing structure with regolith struck me as a real challenge. And so I found this construction technique in NASA did a lunar habitability study back in, I think it was 2009. And this was one of the candidates. You excavate about 1 meter to 2 meter deep trench area, depending on the density of the regolith. And then you smooth it out and then you sinter it to provide a nice smooth base for the bladder. I'll talk about sintering a little later on. Spread the bladder, and then at ground level, you can cover it with however much regolith you believe the radiation environment requires. And then you inflate the bladder and smooth out the regolith. One of the important restrictions, of course, is that this has to be a low angle arch. You have to keep the side angles below the angle of repose, otherwise all the regolith falls off. Next slide. Moving all that regolith is not a job for a shovel. It represents about 10,000 cubic meters of regolith, but NASA has a solution to that. They've built and operated a prototype rover they call Chariot, and somebody at NASA even developed a small lightweight bulldozer blade, which is called Lance. It's a really tortured NASA acronym, and it doesn't matter what it stands for, but that's the bulldozer blade. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to quickly go through each of the habitats. Most of them have a very common floor plan. The angles on the edges of the habitat are very low, so it's only usable for storage and some environmental control equipment. There's room for the 24 individual rooms for 24 crew members. And just as you'd expect, there's some lavatory space, recreation, exercise, feeding area, and common area. The operations habitat also has a 4-bed medical clinic, if you will, to serve the medical needs of the crew and visitors. Next slide. Each room looks something like this. It's kind of like a cruise ship room. I decided on queen beds because some of the participants, some of the crew members may in fact be couples. And also we have 2 different habitats that are going to be housing people. If one of them suffered a critical failure and became uninhabitable, folks could double up. The other thing you notice is that there's a fish tank and a garden wall as a separator between the adjacent rooms. There's a lot of psychological benefit to plants, and they're not pets. It's going to be in the food chain, but there'll be a fish tank and the garden wall in each room. Next slide, please. So this is a hotel. It's very much like the ops habitat, except for in the lower right-hand corner, you see there's research lab space in lieu of the medical facility. The other obvious difference, since it's blue, is the reserve water tank. I struggled when I realized how much reserve water we would need as a safety precaution. I despaired where I might put it, and then I decided that we'll just make it a swimming pool in the hotel. And so there it is. Next slide. The garden is just that. There's row upon row of vertically stacked hydroponic trays for growing all kinds of fruits and vegetables. Next slide, please. There's a wide range of things that can be grown, typical salad components, lettuces and stuff like that. And also we can grow fruits like strawberries and blueberries, and we can also grow fruits that we usually call vegetables like tomatoes and cucumbers. Next slide. The last of the 4 modules is the fish farm. 2 large grow out tanks, fingerling tanks to raise the small fry from hatched eggs. And this is the most different from the other facilities, but still has an airlock at each end and typical things. The finishing tank is intended as a place to put the fish just before you harvest them, and you don't feed them for a week so that they're nice and fresh and taste better, apparently. Next slide. Golden tilapia seems to be the fish of choice. These tilapia grow very quickly, like up to 1/2 to 3/4 of a kilogram in less than 8 months. They're very hardy. They're disease resistant, and so that's the fish of choice. Now you notice at the bottom there's another fast growing critter. These are tiger prawns. The only problem with them is that most commercial growers get them post-larval. Their growth cycle is rather more complicated and difficult, but some diversity, some diet diversity, that might be worth checking into. Next slide. So the 4 modules are arranged in a big square configuration with interconnecting tunnels. I've planned a large rotating heliostat above the junction there with splitter mirrors to direct light through clerestory windows in the fronts of each of the habitats. And with a reasonable sized heliostat, I believe we can get, when the sun is out, we can get 5 to 800 lux throughout the area. Only the garden will require supplemental lighting for the most part. Next slide. So we're going to have this base. We're going to have to earn our keep. And many people have talked about, well, we got this water on the moon, we'll just make rocket propellant. And it really sounded great. Back in 2016, ULA offered to buy Hydrolocks for $3,000 a kilogram in LEO, or 500 on the lunar surface. And that engaged a lot of people. And I've read a couple of studies that were based on, can we mine enough water on the lunar surface to make a go of that? Well, it turns out that those numbers are really an artifact of expendable launch vehicle technology. If ULA would really do that, I'd be on the phone with Gwen Shotwell tomorrow to order up a Falcon Heavy for $90 million that would carry 64 metric tons to LEO, and I earn $102 million profit. But that's not going to happen. So the Hermes base needs more than just Hydrolocks as a profit to be successful. Next slide, please. So my apologies that this slide is a bit of an eye test, but that's part of the message. There's lots of things that you can do to earn money on the lunar surface, we hope. Obviously, rocket propellant, both Hydrolocks and Methalox, I'll get to that later. We'll be able to create nitrogen from the ammonia that's one of the volatiles on the lunar surface for habitat and spacecraft atmospheres. We can use it, and I believe we'll be able to sell it to other lunar bases in the area. We're going to be growing fruits, vegetables, and fish, and we can provide food to other lunar operations. Victor's mining operation could probably use some fresh produce, as well as possibly even as a rest and recreation site for other lunar bases, because some of them may be rather austere. We'd have housing for visiting scientists, NSA, NASA, NSF, and NIH could fund them. And so we'd housing and support for lunar vacationers. It would be expensive, but I don't think, the guy who put up $28 million to go to space with Jeff Bezos next week, could probably afford one of these too. advertising revenue from social media productions. This would be a great story, and I believe there's a lot of money to be made. If now, not enough to fund, Mars One, but there's money to be made. And also, the far side of the moon is a great place for a radio telescope, and there's other advantages of having optical telescopes on the moon. We could provide site surveys and other support to those activities. And when on-orbit construction gets in gear, we could sell construction materials, either the processed aluminum, iron, and silicon that these operations will need, or if they want to process it themselves, we can just build them a mass driver and just launch that stuff off the lunar surface. And if the mass driver would only have to be a few kilometers long. And if you wonder whether this is a good opportunity or not, I highly recommend reading High Frontier and doing the math. I think that's a big opportunity. Next slide, please. So most of those products, other than the hospitality-oriented ones, involve mining the lunar regolith. And so let's talk about that now. Next slide, please. Most of you have seen the LCROSS results of the sublimates, the volatiles that they measured. Almost half of it was water, but there was lots of other interesting things, sources of carbon and nitrogen, et cetera. Next slide. So a lot of lunar mining concepts involve bulldozers and payloaders. And given how severe the dust problem will be on the lunar surface, I don't think that's the right way to go. In the mid 2000s, Dr. Taylor at NASA put 80 grams of actual lunar regolith in a microwave oven and nuked it, and he got heating rates of about 1,000 degrees C per minute. He described it as the stuff melted faster than you could boil your tea water. And that was at 2.45 gigahertz, the typical frequency of a microwave oven. It turns out that some simulation studies have indicated that at a lower frequency, you get better regolith penetration. That's the upper left plot there. And so an antenna array, these are 10 dB horns. You put 100 watts in, you get a kilowatt out, seemingly free. And you create an array of these, the width of your rover, and creep along the lunar surface, heating it up. Next slide, please. And we create a capture tent around the rover and a cold trap trailer so that the radiant energy heats up the regolith, sublimates the volatiles, they collect in the tent, and they migrate to the cold trap, which is still cold, and they refreeze, and then the rover kind of creeps along, collecting the volatiles. Next slide, please. And then we take it to the gas processing plant, where we can separate the volatiles into their component parts. The processes to get the products we want are common, well understood industrial processes on Earth, including things like electrolysis, the Sabatier process to create methane, and the Klaus process to extract sulfur. And so, next slide. No, leave it on this slide for a minute, James. So, with 1 day's rover operation, we believe we can harvest over 3,000 kilograms of water, have about 400 kilograms of hydrogen in excess of the water, have about 600 kilograms of methane, which is important because the Starship is fueled with liquid oxygen and methane, and about 120 kilograms of nitrogen to use as a diluent in the spacecraft and habitat atmospheres, and about almost 900 kilograms of sulfur. And at first, when I submitted the paper, I thought, I don't know what we're going to do with, almost a metric ton of sulfur. It turns out I found a study where people who were studying sintering blocks of regolith to make basically building blocks for structures. The sintered regolith tends to be crumbly and doesn't have a really great compressive strength. But they found if they soaked it in molten sulfur for some period of time, I don't recall exactly how long it was, they got an order of magnitude improvement in the compressive strength of these sintered regolith blocks. So now we have a use for at least some of the sulfur. Next slide, please. So I envision a crew of 24, kind of the usual things. We got someone, conducting the orchestra, doctor and a nurse, and I would insist that some of the other crew members are qualified wilderness paramedics. People, keeping the habitat going, people growing the fruits and vegetables and tending to the fish. And social media, just the kind of things you'd expect. Total of 24 people. Next slide. So my only question is, when do we leave? And next slide. If you folks have any questions. James, thank you very, very much for flipping the slides.
I have a question for you, Carl. What is your background?
My first job when I graduated from college was working on the Apollo lunar module program, and I've been a space geek ever since. And this design contest kind of gave me a chance to kind of reconnect with some of the technical details. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and your work is very impressive to me. So thank you for everything you've done. Do we have any questions from the audience? I don't see any yet. I would ask, how would you govern the settlement? You have about 24 people, you said. Obviously, there's a manager and an assistant manager, but would you have some type of way for people to decide on the rules and the policies of the settlement?
Well, I think that in one sense, because this is a fairly high risk operation, that this has to be run, as I characterized the paper, at least initially, it's kind of a military basis. There has to be a chain of command. People have to do what they're expected to do. As time goes on, as safety protocols are established, then I would imagine it evolving towards a more democratic, collaborative kind of governance style.
And then how would you make, if we assume that there's lots of tourists on the moon and they're looking for places to visit, how would you make this facility appealing to them?
Well, I've got a swimming pool.
That's true.
Well, I thought of, the first thing I think of when I think of going to the moon is I would like to see the Apollo 11 landing site. That's a long way from the South Pole. And so it's not likely that would be on offer. I think that at least initially, people are going to want to go kind of because it's there, to reuse a famous quote. Just being on the lunar surface will have one of the other components that NASA was evaluating for that Chariot rover is an enclosed cabin version that you could use to take people around. I just think that not for a long time, but a week, I would just being there would be enough. And example, one of the things I didn't show when I tried to cost out the program, one of the things that people are going to go there, and the way I laid it out is, in addition to the crew of 24, there'd be a construction crew of 20 people who would accompany the operations crew initially to get this thing built out in a timely manner. And I thought, what would we have to pay these people? And I picked the most dangerous job on Earth, and that's being a saturation diver. They have an occupational death rate 40 times the average, and these folks make $2,000 a day. And so I thought, well, $2,000 a day, I could recruit 20 people. And then it occurred to me that if we put an ad in the paper, kind of a Shackleton type ad, men wanted, or men and women wanted more appropriately, that we'd have to beat people off with a stick to, come spend 4 months on the moon and help build a lunar base. I think that people, I'm sure the fascination will wear off and they'll want to go someplace where the ground is red. But for now, I think it would be a draw unto itself.
Your design features a rotating heliostat in the middle of the 4-module configuration. Can you explain a little bit what that is? That sounds really interesting.
Well, it's a concave mirror. I think it was 20 square meters, something like that. That is angled downward so that it, collects the sunlight, focuses it straight down, and at the base of the heliostat, there's a 4-way splitter mirror. They're stationary, and so that will direct the beam, split it up, and send it into the 4 cabins through these windows. There'll be a window above basically a window above the door, where the light can shine in and get redistributed with other mirrors if possible. Sun's pretty bright, and I was surprised when I said I wanted 500 to 800 lux, which is kind of like office level illumination. And when I figured out how big this heliostat would have to be, it was manageable size, certainly smaller than the solar panels that I envision using. But, having 1/6 gravity and no wind makes those things easier.
And how would you fund the base? I think on one of your appendix slides, there's a cost estimate of about $858 million. How would you raise those funds for the base?
Yeah, it's obviously a very top level cost estimate, but it still comes out to less than the cost of one SLS launch, which I thought was interesting. But
yes.
Like most enterprises like this, there would be some investors. If it's a billion, some of the other estimates for some of these programs, and they're much more comprehensive than mine, are in the $60 billion range. And that's in a whole different league. $1 billion, I think you could raise pretty readily. I forecast that within a couple of years, it could be, cash flow positive, and that my sense of how it would evolve is that the crew and the people as part of the organization, that obviously be some earth-based support, they would be able to have a growing stake in the business. And in other words, the venture capitalists would take their money and be done, and the people who are doing the work and who are on the lunar surface would ultimately be able to have more autonomy and more independence.
Okay. And then just because I'm a project manager, I have to show your schedule slide, because I was just very impressed that you have a Gantt chart type slide on your presentation deck in the appendix. Yeah, so about 23 weeks of build for that end to end.
Yes, that's the schedule. And it turns out that the site preparation rover, which is that Chariot rover with the bulldozer blade, is kind of on the critical path, because you got to you clear the areas and then I thank you for reminding me. I said I'd talk about sintering, and then I didn't. If you could go back to the slide, the beginning of the mining section, there's 2 different plots along with the antennas.
Sure.
Yeah, back one.
This one?
There you go, right. So the upper one of those plots is 0.5 gigahertz, and you get a lot of regolith penetration, a lot of regolith heating. At 10 gigahertz, there's very little penetration, and all the radiant energy stays in the top few centimeters of the regolith. Well, that's exactly what you want if you want to melt it and get it to resolidify solid and smooth. And so it would require a different antenna array, different RF system because the very different frequency range. But we would have a system that would bolt onto that Chariot rover that would center the area under the habitats. And we could also center pathways that are going to be traversed typically by the crews and by the other rovers, as well as centering landing pads and things like that for arriving spacecraft. But in terms of
No, go ahead, Carl.
and that it turns out that the RF cost is the RF equipment cost is not a significant player in the mining thing. So as far as the schedule is concerned, maybe want to add another rover to speed up the site preparation and some of the other work that needs to be done. Having the extra 20 people, I think, makes a difference in getting this done. Another thing that didn't make it, well, it didn't make it on schedule because I thought of it after I had created the schedule. There's a significant radiation hazard prior to completion of those habitats. The Starship cabin will be protected, the habitats will be protected, but until the habitats are built, we've got crews working out on the lunar surface that, if we get notice of a solar particle event, we got to get those people into some kind of safe situation. As you may have noticed, the Starship has a little elevator going down the side, and getting 44 people off the lunar surface is going to be a challenge. So I included the immediate construction of a smaller radiation habitat to get the crews out of harm's way in the event that they're notified about a solar particle event. And so we do that first. And until that was built, we would restrict the number of people out on the lunar surface to the number of people that could be recovered through that 4-person elevator within the warning time of the particle events.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Carl. This was a great presentation. And thank you so much. And congratulations again. You won second place in our contest. Very good job. And thank you for participating in our conference today.
Well, thank you, James. And thank you for the rest of the society.
Awesome.